Vice President Mike Pence returning home from the annual APEC summit in Papua New Guinea. Trade tensions between the U.S. and China took center stage at that economic forum, where for the first time ever, the leaders failed to agree on a formal written declaration.
Now we're going to bring in Christian Whiton. He's a former State Department senior advisor in the Trump administration and George W. Bush administration as well. Christian, good to see you. Thank you. A bunch of questions off the top because this is very complicated, as you well know. So in terms of assuring allies of U.S. commitment to the region, who had the better presentation, Vice President Pence or President Xi? What are our allies there in the Asia-Pacific looking for? And how does this tee up that meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi at the G20 that Trey just mentioned? And also, what can we expect to come out of that meeting?
You know, I think U.S. allies are looking for a continued U.S. commitment. There had been a lot of, frankly, misinformation because the United States had withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump had identified as a flawed trade agreement. That was misinterpreted as U.S. withdrawal early in the Trump administration. But if you look at Trump's presence, his own trips to the region, Vice President Pence's trips to the region, and the fact that we're standing up to the Chinese, standing up with freedom of navigation, assertions of force in the South China Sea, showing up with economic development that, unlike the Chinese, does not trap people into a debt trap. We are not trying to make economic colonies in the Pacific, but in fact trying to empower people, trade with people, reform trade. So all of that is looking good. And Vice President Pence reasserted that at this trip. You know, looking ahead down the road at the G20, the next big summit where you'll have President Trump and Xi Jinping, I think they have there's a lot of hype about a potential breakthrough on trade. I don't think it's going to happen just because I don't think Xi Jinping is in a political position to make any concessions.
Interesting. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un is clinging to his nukes, and China is a key player to coax him to denuclearize, not to mention that North Korea is an important trading partner with China. So what kind of pressure does this put on President Trump's trade negotiations with China?
Yeah, China, it always goes through a cycle where it's tougher on North Korean sanctions and actually does maybe what it says it's going to do earlier in a cycle of aggression and then slowly starts making concessions and liberalizing trade. We have seen some of that between China and North Korea, and there's talk that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, may pay a state visit to North Korea soon. You know, I think the counterbalance to that is that President Trump needs to make very clear that if North Korea's capabilities expand, and certainly if it resumes nuclear or ballistic missile testing, it hasn't done that while we've been in talks. But if it was, that would only bring more and more U.S. and allied capabilities, more U.S. forces to the Pacific. Japan might spend more on its military. We might coordinate better with Taiwan, other force multipliers like that. And that is a message that should keep China willing to pressure North Korea.
And you mentioned that President Xi is reportedly considering visiting North Korea, accepting an invitation from Kim Jong-un, a demonstrative move on the world stage. Any potential ripple effects for President Trump?
You know, I don't think so. There still look like good signs going into a potential second summit between Trump and Kim. You had sort of a meeting of the minds at their first summit to denuclearize, but none of the details of denuclearization nor a sort of statement that quantifies exactly where North Korea's nuclear talks are. So there is talk about getting them together again, because at the end of the day, those are the only two decision makers that can really agree to fundamental change. I could see President Trump might be a bit worried because before his Singapore summit, when Kim met with Xi Jinping, especially in Dalian, the Chinese island, it sort of put them on a different track. Trump had to postpone that summit in order to get the North Koreans back on track. So I think there is, you know, you could forecast turbulence, but things are still going okay.
Meanwhile, look, negotiating is President Trump's jam. You know, you mentioned the TPP. Some people criticized his decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So how does President Trump end up the victor on behalf of American companies in this trade war with China and, Christian, throw spikes, if you will, in China's path to economic domination?
Yeah, it's a key point. In many ways, just by deciding to fight, he has already changed things fundamentally for the better. You know, administrations of both parties really going back to the 1980s and certainly looking the other way at the 1989 Tiananmen massacre in China. They've had a view that just engaging with China, that enriching China will make it a better behaved and more free country. Just has not happened. You know, sticking with his guns and insisting on real change, not just sort of an agreement and maybe an agreement by China to buy some more Boeing planes or soybeans or things like that, but demanding fundamental change. And realistically, I think understanding that China is unlikely to come in from the cold. They're unlikely to change their behavior. And to the extent we want to expand trade.
They're working on that One Belt, One Road program where they want to, connect, 8 Asian countries that they can dominate economically.
Exactly, and that's one message Vice President Pence has carried in APEC and elsewhere at a major speech he gave at the Hudson Institute last month, which is that this is economic colonialism, essentially. You get cruddy infrastructure from the Chinese, you get a lot of debt, you get a lot of economic control and all of that entails with Chinese dominance. So really, and also we've created something called the U.S. Build Act, which will enable U.S. More loan guarantees, not handouts, but resources that these countries can use if they do not want to become dependent on China.
All right, Christian Whiton, we have to leave it there. It was a lot to cover. Thank you for breaking it down for us.
Thank you, Arthel.
Take care.